Good morning from southeastern Finland in northern Europe. Here's my selective summary of the events of 1979. My main source is the English language Wikipedia article about that year. It was a common year, and in the Gregorian calendar, it began on Monday. On January the 1st, 1979, the United Nations Secretary General and later Austrian Federal President, Mr. Kurt Waldheim, heralded the start of the International Year of the Child. The United States and the People's Republic of China established full diplomatic relations. On January the 7th, the People's Army of Vietnam and Vietnamese-backed Cambodian insurgents announced the fall of Phnom Penh, Cambodia, and Pol Pot's regime's collapse. Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge retreated west to an area along the Thai border, ending large-scale fighting in the Cambodian-Vietnamese War. Pol Pot would die in obscurity in or around April 1998. On January the 16th, 1979, following months of growing protests, the last Shah, or Shah Emperor of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, fled to Egypt with his family. Actually, there had been unrest since early 1978. On January the 19th, former US Attorney General and advisor to former US President Richard Nixon, John Mitchell, was released on parole after 19 months at a federal prison in Alabama. On January the 25th, Pope John Paul II arrived to Mexico City for his first visit to Mexico, mainly for the Latin American Episcopal Conference, or Conference of Puebla, of 1979. On February the 1st, 1979, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini returned to Tehran, Iran, after nearly 15 years of exile. On February the 2nd, former Sex Pistols bassist Sid Vicious was found dead, aged 21, of a heroin overdose in New York City, the day after being released from a 55-day sentence at Rikers Island prison on bail. On March the 1st, 1979, devolution referendums were held in Wales and Scotland on establishing regional assemblies, elected assemblies with a limited taxation power. In Wales, about 2/3 of the participating voters rejected the devolution proposal. In Scotland, a narrow majority, over 51% of those voting, approved it, but because the majority was so feeble and the voter turnout was also rather low by that time standards, the devolution proposal failed to get the minimum requirement, which was at least 40% of the eligible voters' support. After the results became known, Prime Minister James Callaghan announced that his minority Labour government would not pursue the devolution policies. On March the 26th, 1979, in a ceremony at the White House, President Anwar Sadat of Egypt and Prime Minister Menachem Begin of Israel signed an Egypt-Israel peace treaty, whereby Egypt became the first Arab country to formally recognize Israel and to establish full diplomatic relations with it. US President Jimmy Carter had since September 1978 tried to broker an agreement between these two countries, and the preliminary agreement had been signed already in September 1978. On March the 28th, 1979, the British House of Commons passed by a single vote margin a vote of no confidence against Prime Minister Callaghan's minority Labour government. Callaghan therefore announced that as soon as the House of Representatives had completed its work on the legislative proposals which it was then considering, he would ask the Queen to dissolve Parliament and to call early elections for March the 3rd, 1979. The scheduled elections would have had to be held in any way by October or November 1979, given the British parliamentary term of 5 years. And nowadays, the British parliamentary elections normally take place every 5 years unless the House of Commons passes by, is it a 2/3 majority, a resolution to hold them earlier. On the same day, the United States' most serious nuclear power plant accident occurred at 3 Mile Island in Pennsylvania. On March the 31st, Milk and Honey won the Eurovision Song Contest 1979 for Israel with the song Hallelujah. On April the 1st, Iran's government became an Islamic republic by a 98% vote, overthrowing the Shah officially. On April the 11th, Kampala, Uganda's capital, fell to Tanzanian troops, and the brutal dictator Idi Amin fled. Denmark granted Greenland a limited autonomy or self-government with its own parliament sitting in Nuuk or Godthåb. In 2009, Greenland received an expanded self-government, which many see, or quite many see, as the first step toward full independence from Denmark. On May the 4th, Margaret Thatcher became the first one of, at present, only 2 female British prime ministers. The outgoing British Prime Minister Theresa May is the second one. Both of them were conservatives. The late Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher passed away in March or April 2013. So on May the 4th, Margaret Thatcher took office, and she would hold it for 11.5 years until November the 28th, 1990, when a caucus revolt forced her to resign. On May the 10th, 1979, the Federated States of Micronesia in Oceania became self-governing. In June 1979, McDonald's introduced the Happy Meal. On June the 1st, the first Black African-led government of Rhodesia, now known as Zimbabwe, in 90 years took power in succession to Ian Smith under his power-sharing deal. On June the 2nd, Pope John Paul II, originally called Karol Wojtyła, arrived to his native Poland in Central Eastern Europe on his first official 9-day stay, becoming the first pope to visit a communist country. This visit, known as 9 Days That Changed the World, brought about the Polish people's solidarity against communism, ultimately leading to the solidarity movement's rise. On June the 4th, 1979, following closely fought and rather indecisive elections, federal parliamentary elections on May the 22nd, Joseph Clark, normally known as Joe Clark, the Progressive Conservative Party's federal leader, became Canada's new and 16th and youngest prime minister. He was sworn in the day before he turned 40. On June the 7th, the European Parliament's members were directly elected for the first time. There were 410 members of the European Parliament back then. This also was the first international election in history. On June the 18th, Jimmy Carter and the ailing Soviet dictator Leonid Brezhnev signed the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty 2 agreement in Vienna, Austria, but that treaty became void, technically because the United States Senate never ratified it. On July the 1st, 1979, Sweden outlawed corporal punishment at home. The Sony Walkman went on sale for the first time in Japan. On July the 15th, 1979, US President Jimmy Carter spoke for about 33 minutes on the national television, expressing his profound concern about the American people's emotional and spiritual condition, as well as their economic and political ones, claiming that there was a crisis of confidence in the United States and urging the Americans to recapture their sense of self-confidence. Okay, I'll try to get the next news item, which is a sports news item. It deals with the retired British middle distance runner Sebastian Cove. During the summer of 1979, he broke 3 world records. Yes, in the space of 41 days. Yes. In Oslo, Norway, he first broke the 800-meter world record. He then went on to break the mile world record and capped off the season by breaking the 1500-meter world record in Zurich, Switzerland, becoming the first person to hold all 3 records at the same time. The records were using digital timing: 1 minute 42.33 seconds, 3 minutes 48.95 seconds, and 3 minutes 32.03 seconds. Although under the rules set by that time, they had to be rounded up, not down to the nearest 1/10 of a second, so they were listed as 142.3, 349.0, and 332.1. At the time, and still for some years into the 1980s, Cove was known for his intense rivalry on the sports track with fellow British middle distance runner Steve Ovett, who, contrary to Cove, also competed several times in 5,000 meters. On July the 16th, 1979, Iraqi President Hassan al-Bakr resigned and Vice President Saddam Hussein al-Tikriti replaced him. This was not a voluntary handover because al-Bakr had been under threat. On July the 17th, 1979, the autocratic Nicaraguan president, General Anastasio Somoza Debayle, resigned and fled to Miami, Florida. On July the 22nd, 1979, in the purge of the Iraqi Ba'ath Party, President Saddam Hussein arranged the arrest and later execution of nearly 70 members of his ruling Ba'ath Party. This informal trial-like session of the Ba'ath Party's leadership was videotaped. On August the 3rd, 1979, dictator Francisco Macias Nguema of Equatorial Guinea was overthrown in a bloody coup d'etat led by Teodoro Obiang Nguema Mbasogu. On August the 10th, 1979, Michael Jackson, an African-American pop and rock singer, released his breakthrough album Off the Wall, which would sell 7 million copies in the United States alone, making it a 7 times platinum album. On August the 17th, the controversial, religious, satirical, and, according to conservative Christians, blasphemous film Monty Python's Life of Brian, which parodied the life of Jesus, premiered in the United States. Off the coast of Ireland, on August 27th, 1979, Lord Mountbatten of Burma and 2 others were killed immediately in a bombing by Provisional Irish Republican Army assassins. Mountbatten was a British admiral, statesman, and an uncle of the Duke of Edinburgh. Doreen Knatchbull, Baroness Brabourne, would die in a hospital the following day, on August the 28th, from her injuries in the Mountbatten bombing. On September the 7th, 1979, the first cable sports channel, ESPN, known as the Entertainment Sports Programming Network, was launched. On September the 13th, 1979, South Africa, which still was practicing the racial segregation policy known as the apartheid, granted independence to the homeland, in quotation marks, of Venda, not recognized outside South Africa. These so-called homelands were in the country's infertile regions, and supposedly they gave the country's disenfranchised black majority some measure of self-government. On September the 20th, 1979, French paratroopers helped David Dacko to overthrow the autocratic Emperor Bokassa in the Central African Republic. On October the 1st, 1979, Nigeria in Central Africa terminated military rule, and the Second Nigerian Republic was established. On October the 26th, 1979, the autocratic or authoritarian president of South Korea, Mr. Park Chung-hee, or Park Chung-hee, was assassinated by KCIA director Kim Jeju. On November the 1st, 1979, there was a military coup in Bolivia, South Africa. On November the 4th, 1979, the Iran hostage crisis began, as 500 Iranian radicals, mostly students, invaded the US embassy in Tehran, Iran's capital, and took 90 hostages, 53 of whom were Americans. They demanded that the United States send the former Shah of Iran, who was then seriously ill, back and undergoing medical treatment in the United States, back to stand trial. On November the 7th, 1979, US Senator Edward Kennedy of Massachusetts announced that he would challenge President Jimmy Carter for the 1980 Democratic presidential nomination. On November the 12th, 1979, in response to the hostage crisis in Tehran, US President Jimmy Carter ordered a halt to all oil imports into the United States from Iran. On the same day, Mr. Süleyman Demirel of the Justice Party formed the 43rd government of the Republic of Turkey, a minority government. On November the 14th, US President Carter issued Executive Order 12,170, freezing all Iranian assets in the United States and US banks in response to the hostage crisis. On November the 15th, British art historian and former surveyor of the Queen's Pictures, Anthony Blunt's role as the fourth man of the Cambridge Five double agents for the Soviet NKVD, the predecessor of the notorious KGB during the Second World War, was revealed by Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher in the British House of Commons. She gave further details on November the 21st. On December the 5th, 1979, Jack Lynch resigned as the Taoiseach, or Prime Minister of the Republic of Ireland. Charles Hoy succeeded him. On December the 6th, the world premiere of Star Trek, the motion picture, was held at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. On December the 9th, the eradication of the smallpox virus was certified, making it the first of only two human diseases that had been driven to extinction, Rinderpest in 2011 being the other. On December the 12th, 1979, the NATO made the double-track decision to offer the Warsaw Pact, the opposing Soviet-led military alliance, a mutual limitation of medium-range ballistic missiles and intermediate-range ballistic missiles, combined with a threat that in case of disagreement, NATO would deploy more middle-range nuclear weapons in Western Europe following the so-called Euro missile crisis. On the same day, the coup d'etat of December the 12th happened in South Korea. South Korean Army Major General Chun Do-hwan ordered the arrest of Army Chief of Staff Jong Sung-hwa without authorization from the new South Korean President Choi Kyu-ha, alleging involvement in the assassination of the previous President Park Chung-hee. On December the 13th, 1979, the minority progressive conservative federal government of Canada, which had just introduced an austerity budget to reduce the country's large federal budget deficit, including a controversial proposed 18-cent a gallon tax on petrol or gasoline fell on a vote of no confidence introduced by a new Democratic or Social Democratic member of parliament, who ironically later would become a liberal. The vote was 139 to 133. On December the 14th, 1979, the defeated Prime Minister Joe Clark formally requested the Canadian Governor General to dissolve the House of Commons and to organize a snap federal parliamentary election for February the 18th, 1980. Those elections would result in the Progressive Conservatives' defeat and the Liberals' return to power, formally on March the 3rd, 1980, with Pierre Trudeau becoming Prime Minister for the second and last time. On December the 24th, 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in Central Asia, and Babrak Karmal replaced the overthrown and executed President Hafizullah Amin, which began the war. It would drag on until the spring of 1989 and result in the Soviet Union's humiliating defeat to the Mujahideen guerrillas, who used the mountainous Afghan landscape, for example, and the local population support to launch attacks, periodic attacks on the Soviet forces stationed in Afghanistan, and then would retreat and would be very difficult to track down. On December the 26th, 1979, in Rhodesia, 96 Patriotic Front guerrillas entered the capital Salisbury to monitor a ceasefire that began on December the 28th. In 1979, China introduced the one-child policy in order to reduce the population growth rate and prevent potential overcrowding, especially of China's large cities. It contributed to the missing women of China, because many, or quite many, conservative-minded or traditionally minded Chinese farmer parents either actively killed or then just abandoned their female babies because they feared that the one-child policy would lead to the loss of family name in the cases of most daughters, because most daughters would get married. The one-child policy was eased in 2013.